Hi, everyone. So this is the breakout room on the Mangrove Nine. Our speaker is Robin Bunce. He has written extensively on British Black Power, including Renegade, The Life and Times of Darkest Howe, which is co-authored with Paul Field, as well as recording Here to Stay, as well as co-editing Here to Stay, Here to Fight, a Race Today anthology.
Well, thank you enormously for inviting me to speak today, and I hope this is of some interest. My talk is about Darkest Howe, Black Power and the Mangrove Nine, and I'm focusing on the period 1967 to 1972, and I'm focusing primarily on London. I'm a historian. I have nothing at all to say about today, and nothing at all really to say about how people should organise, how Black people should organise politically today. All I can do is talk about how people organise themselves and how Black people particularly organise themselves in the period of Black Power in Britain. And what I'm suggesting is that the period of Black Power really occurs at the end of the 60s and at the beginning of the 1970s. What I want to do now is, by focusing on one person and one campaign, talk about more kind of general themes which were going on in the Black Power movement in the late 60s and the early 70s. So we today are in July 2020, and my story starts in July 1967, which according to my calculator is 53 years ago. And I want to start by thinking about the Dialectics of Liberation conference, which took place in July 1967. And this was a conference which brought the counterculture, the international counterculture, to the heart of London in a 2-week conference organized by R.D. Laing and leading figures in the anti-psychiatry movement. Speakers included Beat Generation writers William Burroughs and Allen Ginsberg. It featured Emmett Grogan, the founder of the San Francisco anarchist movement, the Diggers. It focused Herbert Marcuse, who no doubt you've heard of as a neo-Marxist and one of the key figures in the Frankfurt School. And the conference practiced the countercultural values that it preached, spontaneously transforming the Roundhouse and Camden's pubs and bars into the anti-University of London. A kind of, an academic institution, but beyond the normal boundaries of academic institutions. The most controversial speaker by far was Stokely Carmichael, who you can see here in the center of this picture. And he was the one Black person who was given a kind of headline slot at the conference. And there you can see him surrounded by Frankie Y, Michael X, Roy Saw, and Obbe Obbe. And these 4 individuals sitting to his left and to his right, those are kind of the leading figures in the first wave of the British Black Power movement. Carmichael, as I said, was hugely controversial. The Mirror, the Daily Mirror, branded him as an evil campaigner of hate. The Daily Sketch, which merged into the Daily Mail a couple of years later, described him as the most effective preacher of racial hatred at large today. And the British government was incredibly concerned about Carmichael's visit to the country. Conscious of troubles in Detroit and in Newark and in New Jersey, the British government were extremely concerned that there would be similar violence if Stokely Carmichael spoke in London. Now, Carmichael's visit did not have the destabilizing effect that the British government had feared, but in spite of this, it did send shockwaves through the British polity. And within a week of Carmichael's talk, Carmichael had been expelled from Britain, and he was also denied entry to most Commonwealth countries on the basis that he was just far too dangerous as far as governments were concerned to have in the country. Carmichael also, his visit also precipitated the formation of the first ever British Black Power organisation. There had been a number of individuals who had associated themselves with the ideology of Black Power prior to Carmichael's visit, but it's really Carmichael's visit that leads to the formation of the first group. And the first group is the first groups, or the first people who feature in the Black Power movement in Britain. I'm going to introduce you to them now. The first person who really grabs the media's attention is this person here who's known as Michael X. Michael X was a name given to him by the British media. It's not a name that he gave himself. He was really known as Michael de Freitas, and he was the head of an organization called RAS, the Racial Adjustment Action Society. It was more of a Black nationalist organization than a Black Power organization, but because Michael X had met Malcolm X, and because Michael X had been Stokely Carmichael's tour guide to London in 1967. And because he was well known in the media, he became the media face of the British Black Power movement. Shortly after Carmichael was banned from speaking, or banned from Britain, or invited to leave, I think was technically what happened to him, Michael X gave a speech in Reading. This speech was then reported in the press. Michael X was put on trial for inciting racial hatred, and Michael X became the first person in British history to be sent to prison for inciting racial hatred. So the 1965 Race Relations Act, an act which in some senses has been designed to protect black people, was actually used against black people, and this set a precedent. Numerous black activists were then tried under the Race Relations Act, and following Michael X's successful prosecution at the end of 1967. The first Black Power movement in Britain, however, the first full movement, is led by Obbe Obbe. Obbe Obbe, who you can see here. Egbuna was a Nigerian-born playwright who was based in London. He had worked with SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, in New York in 1966. He'd been inspired by what he saw in America, and after Carmichael's visit, and he was one of the people we saw on stage with Carmichael, after Carmichael's visit, he established the Universal Coloured People's Association, the UCPA, and they launched the Black Power in Britain Black Power Manifesto in September of 1967. So that's only a couple of months after Carmichael's visit. You already have the publication of a Black Power Manifesto in Britain. The UCPA split up, and Egbuna formed the British Black Panther movement within a year of Carmichael's visit. So within a year of Carmichael's visit, you have a number of things happening. You have the foundation of the first British Black Power group. You have the arrest, trial and imprisonment of the leader of Black Power in Britain, or at least the people the media perceive to be the leader of Black Power in Britain. And you also have the foundation of the British Black Panther movement under an explicitly Black Power ideology, and which is set out, as I say, in this manifesto. Egbuna's activities included putting out a newspaper, and the newspaper was called Black Power Speaks. The newspaper really only ran for three issues. You can see there it was issued first of all in May 1968, then in June 1968, and then you have the July edition, so it runs for 3 issues. And what happened to Egbuna after the 3rd issue is that he was arrested. The 4th issue contained an article, which I have here. Where is the article? Here it is. The 4th issue contained an article which was known in the British media as the murder document. And it was entitled "What to Do When the Cops Lay Their Hands on a Black Man at the Speaker's Corner." It's not a murder document at all. It's merely an argument in favour of communal self-defence, which is one of the arguments that is doing the rounds in Black Power circles in the late 1960s. So Egbuna there is kind of in lockstep with the kinds of arguments being made by the Black Panthers in America. So as I say, this is not a murder document at all. It's not a document which in any sense incites murder, but that's what he was charged with by the British state, and that is what he was arrested for. And he was eventually found guilty of that based on this document. Going back to Black Power Speaks ran for 3 issues. And it's really Egbuna's biggest achievement as a leader of Black Power in Britain. And it's in the middle of these. It's in June 1928 that the Black Panthers are established. That's the point at which you get a decisive break between the Universal Coloured People's Association and the Black Panthers. This is a picture of the Black Panthers office taken in August 1968, and it's taken by special branch photographers. I came across this in the National Archives, in police archives, and specifically in special branch archives. And you can see the kinds of intellectual influences which are there acting on the Black Panthers in there, as you know, around the period in which they are formed. I also found in police files a number of things which were used as evidence against Obbe Obbe, and they are kind of ideological statements or statements by the British Black Panther movement. This is the Black Panthers membership rules, which I've published in the Darkenside biography, and I've also published it in an academic article. And what it indicates is that the Black Panthers was a Leninist organization, at least as it was initially conceived. That is to say, it was quite secretive. That is to say, it was aimed at leading a working class revolution, And it was also inspired by Maoism. So there was a kind of emphasis on guerrilla warfare and on street fighting. And you can see that the core members are expected to be skilled in judo, in other kinds of martial arts, and in military training. You also have a Black Panther oath, and this was written by Obbe Obbe. Again, I've published it elsewhere. I won't dwell on that now. But as you can see, in the early days, Obbe is the leading figure in the British Black Panther movement and the leading figure in the British Black Power movement, as Michael X is in prison at this period. So he's the person kind of making the running, at least as far as the media is concerned, and at least as far as public opinion is concerned. Phase 2 of the Black Power movement begins with the conviction of Obbe Obbe at the end of 1968. So in December 1968, Obbe Obbe is found guilty of inciting the murder of police officers, and he's given a 3-year suspended sentence. And the suspended sentence method was a method that was used a lot against black radicals in Britain, and it was used for very clear political purposes. On the one hand, it meant that black radicals were silenced, because the thing about a suspended sentence is if you step out of line, you will then be slapped in prison. So it's a good way of keeping people quiet and shutting people up. But on the other hand, the British state had come under serious attack when they sent Michael X to prison. There was a backlash, and this was a backlash against particularly black radicals initiated a backlash, but also white liberals could see the problems with sending a black person to prison under the Race Relations Act. So in order to avoid these kind of backlashes, prison sentences were avoided by the British state, but suspended sentences were used. And Obbe Obbe is one of the first people to be imprisoned under this kind of a strategy. He was one of the first people to give a suspended sentence under this kind of strategy. So his suspended sentence effectively removes him from the Black Power movement, and a new leadership emerges. And it's in the second phase that we see the Black Power movement really achieving huge successes in Britain. One of the things that happens in this second wave is that the Black Panther movement particularly become interested in the work of CLr James. CLr James is regarded as probably the greatest Caribbean intellectual of the 20th century. He was born in Trinidad. He was a Marxist intellectual, and he was living in London in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And he hooked up with the British Black Panther movement, and the British Black Panthers started reading his work. It's also around this time that you get the emergence of a series of new media forms which begin to convey the Black Power message within the black communities of Britain, particularly in Notting Hill, particularly in Brixton. One of these is The Hustler, and here you have The Hustler ran for a year or so, and it was a grassroots magazine, and it launched the careers of a number of black journalists such as Courtney Tulloch. The Hustler wasn't explicitly a Black Power magazine, but it did contain the writings of Black Power radicals, and it did present a commentary on what was going on in Black Power circles. So you can kind of track the history of the movement, and you can track opinion, particularly in Notting Hill, about Black Power through reading these magazines. Another one is the Black Eagles, and the Black Eagles ran for, I think, 6 issues, although only 4 of them survive in complete form these days. And this was edited by Darkenside. The Black Eagles was a magazine which was edited and run from the Black House. And the Black House was a black commune based in Notting Hill. It was established by Michael X. It was in theory supposed to contain a supermarket which was going to sell West Indian goods. That never really happened. But nonetheless, the Black House was a centre for black radicals. And whatever we think of Michael X gets a bit of a bad press, not least from people like Darkenside, not least from people like Althea Jones-LeConte, who I'm going to speak about in a moment. But whatever judgment history places on him, by founding the Black House, he did at least create a space where genuine black radicals could meet and could begin to organise, particularly against the police. We also get the Freedom News, and the Freedom News is a couple of years later. It's launched in 1972, and the Freedom News kind of builds on these earlier success stories of The Hustler, Black Eagles, and various other Black Power magazines, and becomes the Black Panthers newspaper, and runs for a couple of years. It's produced in Brixton. It's in the second wave that Black radicals begin reading very widely amongst Black literature, and it's in the second wave that Black radicals begin establishing, British Black radicals, or rather Black radicals based in Britain, begin establishing links with radicals across the world. So Darkest Howe, for example, and Michael X travel to the Congress of Black Writers, which takes place in Canada in the autumn of 1968, and it's there they meet Walter Rodney. Darkest then travels from the Congress of Black Writers down south. He crosses the US Canada border illegally, and he ends up in New York, where he works. He joins SNCC, and he works with H. Rap Brown on an education campaign, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. Frantz Fanon was a huge influence on the movement in these days. Darkest particularly was reading Frantz Fanon, and Fanon was informing his attitude or his approach to how to do politics and how to do grassroots politics and how to do grassroots protest. And Angela Davis, she didn't speak at the 1967 conference, but she was there, she was interacting with radicals, and she was well known within the movement in the late 60s and in the early 70s. So here I want to focus on Darkest a bit more. I'm going to talk about a number of different radicals, but I did write the biography of Darkest, so I feel most authoritative when I'm speaking about his life and his contributions to the movement. So one of the things that Darkest does for the British Black Power movement is that he brings an experience of campaigning across the world to campaigns in Britain. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the first major cases that he's involved in is the Ocean Hill-Brownsville campaign of 1968. This is a campaign that he's involved in New York, and he's working with SNCC at the time, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. The Ocean Hill-Brownsville campaign is one of the key moments in the American Black Power struggle, and it's one of those moments where the Black Power movement distinguishes itself very clearly from the civil rights movement that had kind of preceded it. It's also an enormously controversial campaign. The Ocean Hill-Brownsville campaign was a campaign to bring home rule to the education system in New York City. Essentially, New York City had never been subject to Jim Crow laws. New York City's education system, nonetheless, was profoundly segregated, simply by geography. So you had white people, well-off white people living in the south of the city, and you had poor Black people living in the north of the city, particularly in places like Harlem. As a result of this geographical separation, there was an effective segregation of the schooling system in New York. In 1966, the New York authorities began to try and break down the segregation of the New York school system by busing white students north and busing Black students south. White parents formed an organization which resisted this, and therefore the initiative failed. Having failed to try and integrate the system, SNCC and CLr, the Congress of Racial Authority, launched a campaign to say, well, if we're not going to integrate, then we need Black parents to be in charge of schooling. Black parents need to run these schools, and we need to have Black teachers in these schools. That's the way forward. Initially, this had some traction, but in the end, again, this was not white parents who protested about this. This was white teachers who stopped this or tried to stop this initiative dead. And therefore, SNCC and CLr, and Darkest was working with SNCC, as I say, organized a homeschooling revolution, which essentially closed all of the schools in Harlem. Kids were then educated by the community during the school strike. So as I say, Darkest was involved in that there, and it was in this context that he worked with H. Rap Brown. Having run this campaign, or having helped run this campaign in New York, Darkest then traveled to Trinidad in 1970, where he participated in the Black Power Revolution in Trinidad. And the Black Power Revolution lasted for a couple of months, and Black radicals became very, very close to overthrowing the government and seizing state power. And Darkest, as I say, was involved in that movement. And it's the lessons that Darkest learns through the Ocean Hill-Brownsville campaign, and it's the lessons that Darkest learns through the Black Power Revolution in Trinidad that he then brings to Britain and to London when he's one of the key figures in the Mangrove Nine campaign, which I'll talk about in a moment. The second wave of Black Power is also distinguished by two other issues. One is about legal strategy, and the other one is about the role of women. So I'll talk about those in turn. So first of all, legal strategy. As I mentioned, Obbe Obbe was put on trial for attempting to murder, for inciting the murder of police officers. And one of the things that Darkes was concerned about was that Darkes was concerned that any serious black radical in Britain would eventually come up against the police and would eventually be put on trial. This was Darkes's view. And if you look at the history of the matter, it's very clear that that was true. Anybody who identified as a black radical, anyone who's out campaigning, would eventually be put on trial. And the various people who I'm going to introduce to you in a moment, most of them were put on trial for one thing or another. So Darkes's concern was that black radicals needed a legal strategy which would allow them to mount a defense in court and mount a political defense, a black power defense. One of the reasons that Darkes comes to this view is because of the failure of Obbe Obbe to mount a successful defense in 1968 when he's put on trial for the murder of police officers. Obbe Obbe, his initial strategy was what I would call the Charles I strategy, and that is to say that he refused to recognize the authority of the court. Okay, I call this the Charles I strategy because that was the strategy that Charles I used in 1649. For those of you who know anything about the English Civil War, you'll know that that strategy did not go well for Charles I, and Charles I ended up being executed. So the problem with this strategy is that it sounds great, but you are on to a loser. As soon as you adopt that strategy, you have effectively lost the case. So Darkes wanted a strategy which not merely sounded radical, but also held out the possibility of success for black radicals who found themselves in court. Having adopted this Charles I strategy, Obbe Obbe then very quickly rolled back on that and decided to entrust his defense to professional white lawyers. This strategy, Obbe Obbe felt, had more chances of success, but it meant that the Black Power movement broke with Obbe Obbe. As far as black radicals were concerned, entrusting his defense to white lawyers was something that was unthinkable, it was unconscionable. And it's one of the reasons why Obbe Obbe is so quickly eclipsed within the Black Power movement. So Darkes wanted a strategy that was both going to be effective or likely to be effective, and two, a strategy which was consistent with the principles of Black Power. One of those principles being that you don't get white people to fight the battles for you. So Darkes's defense was based on the Magna Carta. Darkes had been a law student at Middle Temple and he'd studied there for 2 years. He was also the nephew of CLr James, and CLr James had identified in 1967 in a speech called the Black Power speech that the front line in the battle between Black Power and the British state was the police, and that therefore black radicals needed to think seriously about how to take on the police. Darkes's strategy, and it comes in a number of different phases, but his initial strategy that he outlines in 1968 at the time that Obbe Obbe is put on trial is to demand an all-black jury. So this is Darkes's idea. And those of you who are familiar with the history of the Black Panther movement in America will recognize that this strategy comes to some extent from America. Okay, this was one of the 10-point program put out by the Black Panthers in America in 1966 was the demand for an all-black jury. And the Black Panthers in America rooted that demand in the American Constitution. Darkes roots his demand for an all-black jury in the British Constitution, specifically in the Magna Carta. But he also appeals to the trial of Michael X, which I've mentioned before, which took place in Reading in 1967. And one of the arguments that Michael X makes in 1967 in his trial is that white juries cannot understand the Caribbean vernacular, and therefore white juries cannot cannot reasonably put black people on trial. They cannot stand in judgment on black people for the simple reason they do not understand the Caribbean vernacular. And Darkes picks up this idea, and he picks up the idea from the Magna Carta that you should have a jury of your peers, and he puts those two together, and in the British context makes this radical argument for an all-black jury. And this is the beginning of Darkes thinking about the legal strategy that he will eventually use along with the other members of the Mangrove Nine in the Mangrove Nine trial of 1971. So as I say, one of the things that emerges early in the second phase of the British Black Power movement is a new serious legal strategy for taking on the police when black radicals find themselves in court. The second aspect of the second phase of the British Black Power movement is the emergence of women, of black women in leading roles within the movement. Now, Obbe Obbe had a very reactionary view of women, and when he was in charge of the British Black Panther movement, that was very, very clear in his writings. So Obbe Obbe based his view of black women on Engels's book concerning the family, private property, and the state, which I'm sure some of you are aware of. And in that book, Frederick Engels argues that women play a fundamentally reactionary role in any kind of working class struggle. And this was Obbe Obbe's view, and this is why under Obbe, women did not really play a particularly prominent role in the British Black Panther movement. But fortunately, Obbe is only in charge of the British Black Panther movement for a few months, and following his eclipse, a number of black women emerge in leading positions in the Black Panther movement. Now, this is not to say that women were not involved in the Black Panther movement beforehand. They were. It's just that their kind of contribution was blocked and not recognised by Obbe Obbe. So one of the people that we should talk about in this context is Althea Jones LeConte. She was born in Trinidad in January 1945, and she attended St George's College, which was one of the kind of elite colonial schools that was established under the period of colonial rule. She was a student, particularly of the natural sciences, and in 1965 she applied. So she put herself forward for something called the Girls Island Scholarship, which is an annual competition run in Trinidad, and the winner of which would get a place in a British university to study. And this is what she won that, and she in 1965 gained a place in University College London as a PhD student in biochemistry. It was whilst in London, it was in 1965 that Althea Jones LeConte's journey towards radicalism began. She describes her experience at a British university as a black student at a British university as experiencing a hostile white environment. And there are various examples of how this plays out in her early experiences at UCL. She becomes politically active in a kind of organized sense. I think it's in 1967. It's difficult to pinpoint exactly when this campaign took place, but I think 1967 is October 1967 is probably the best guess as to when this happened. Essentially, in October 1967, she was looking for accommodation as a student at UCL. She discovered that the UCL Accommodation Bureau had two lists. The first list was a list of landlords who were prepared to take any student, and the second list was a list of landlords who were only prepared to take white students. Consequently, as a member of the Socialist Society at UCL, she set up a campaign and she asked for the support of the Socialist Society. The Socialist Society refused on the basis that if racist white landlords were expelled from this list, then there wouldn't be enough accommodation for white students. So the Socialist Society refused to help. She then organised a sit-in at the Mallet Street University of London Union offices, and this sit-in in order to try and force the predominantly white students' union to take this matter seriously and to back the demands of black students. And the British Black Panther movement, they supported this sit-in, and they turned up and they supported Althea Jones LeConte's initiative, and it was through this that she became involved in the British Black Panther movement. Now, Althea Jones LeConte's role in the movement is disputed. Okay, so there are some people who call her the leader of the movement after Obbe Obbe was eclipsed and after he kind of withdrew from the movement. So some people describe her as the leader. Althea Jones LeConte herself denies this, and she says that there was always a collective leadership of the Black Panther movement, that she was never the leader. I think perhaps one way we can think about this, I spoke to Neil Kenlock, who was the official photographer of the British Black Panther movement, and he puts it like this. He says, "She was never our leader, but she led us." That is to say that although she never had the formal title of leader, she was nonetheless the leading figure in the movement, and it was her influence which kind of shaped the way the Panthers went in the early 1970s, in the period up to and then after the Mangrove trial. So it was in this period when Althea Jones-LeConte was, if not the leader, certainly the leading figure of the movement, that the Panthers changed what they were doing in a number of different ways. So first of all, they developed two bases in London. They develop a base in Railton Road in Brixton, in a squat at 121 Railton Road in Brixton. And that's where Olive Morris is based, and it's a house that Olive Morris has taken over and squatted. So that's the base in South London, but they also develop a base in North London, and it's in Finsbury Park, Tollington Park Road in Finsbury Park. So they develop they spread across the whole of London in the period where Althea Jones-LeConte is playing the leading role. The second thing that happens is that the Panthers become extremely good at responding quickly to police violence or to other forms of discrimination which are happening across London. They have a print shop established in their base at Tollington's Park, and within hours of any report of police violence, they can get flyers out and they can start mobilizing people because they have these bases. Having these two bases, Althea Jones-LeConte explains, was crucial to the Black Panther movement for the simple reason that white landlords were very reluctant to rent space to black people in general, but they refused point blank to rent space to black radicals. So church halls, for example, community centres, there are one or two exceptions to this, but by and large, those spaces were not available to black radicals, and therefore that's why they have these bases in in Brixton and in Finsbury Park. It's also under Althea Jones-LeConte that what the Black Panthers are doing in terms of self-education changes direction. So they start moving away from Black power literature of books by people like Eldridge Cleaver, for example, and towards a more Marxist reading list. And they reading works by Lenin, reading works by Karl Marx himself, reading works reading kind of works in the Marxist canon, as it were. So there we are. So that's Althea Jones-LeConte, one person I wanted to talk about for a moment. Lila Hassan also begins playing an important role in the Black Power movement in the early 1970s. Lila Hassan, this is a picture taken from perhaps the biggest Black Power march in British history, which took place in August 1971. And here, Lila Hassan is leading the march, 1,500 marchers from Trafalgar Square to the American Embassy, on Berkeley Square, and it's a protest at the killing of George Jackson, a Black Panther who was murdered in an American jail. Lila Hassan was part of the Black Unity and Freedom Party. She was also part of the Institute of Race Relations, and there she worked in the Institute of Race Relations Library. And it was in this capacity, in the Institute of Race Relations Library, that Lila Hassan played a leading role in the takeover of that organization. So the Institute for Race Relations was established by white liberals in the late 1960s and received a significant amount of government money. But it was a democratic organization, and members you could join, and then members could vote about who took over the board. So Lila Hassan was one of the people who decided to invite Black radicals to join in large numbers. And it was through this process that Black radicals were able to take over the institution in the early 1970s. And in so doing, get their hands on a significant proportion of money and build a base institute for race relations. Another person I wanted to talk about who emerges in the early 70s as a leading figure in the movement is Liz Obbe, who you can see here on the left. So she grew up in Kendal in the Lake District. And when she was 16, she came to Brixton as part of when she was 18, she came to Brixton as part of a government program. And it was here that she hooked up with the British Black Panther movement. She lived in a squat with Olive Morris on Railton Road, and she records that the whole process of squatting was highly political within the Panther movement. There were some in the Panther movement who thought that squatting was essentially what white hippies did, and therefore it was not really a genuinely radical course of action. But there were others, such as Darkenside, such as Olive Morris, such as herself, who argued that squatting was a radical thing that people could do to appropriate property and to start to build a community and to use it as a kind of, to use these squatted places as kind of basis for action. And that then became the kind of dominant view inside the Panther movement. So as a Panther, she worked on the Freedom News, which was based at 38 Shakespeare Road. She was working with Darkest Hound, Farouk Donde, producing that paper. She was also part of the Sisters Collective, which was the women's wing of the Black Panther movement, which ran a Saturday school, which also took place at Shakespeare Road. Together with Olive Morris, they traveled to Morocco in the 1970s. And when the Black Panther movement became the Black Workers Movement, Obbe was involved in that. Quickly, because I'm just keeping an eye on the time. This is Olive Morris. Olive Morris is also in this picture here. So Olive Morris is one of the people who is remembered from the British Black Panther movement these days. She was born in Jamaica, although she was schooled in Britain. She was a member of the Panther movement. And I think she's the person who really pulls the Panthers in the direction of squatting as a kind of political activity. And as I say, she squatted 121 Railton Road. And when Darkest Howe established the Race Today collective in the middle of the 70s, it was Olive Morris who was able to help them establish a base of operations for the Race Today collective and for their magazine by squatting 2 places on Railton Road. So she was crucial in that. Olive Morris is perhaps best remembered these days for establishing the Black Women's Group, which was based in Brixton. And I think she's really interesting if we compare her with Althea Jones-LeConte, for example. So there are 2 women, both in the Black Panther movement, 2 women both playing kind of a leading role in the Black Panther movement. But there's a very, very clear difference between the 2 in terms of Olive Morris wants to emphasize the importance of gender in politics, whereas Althea Jones-LeConte wants to emphasize the importance of class in politics. And I'm sure that both of them recognize gender as important, both of them recognize class as important, but they had a different emphasis on which of the 2 was more important. And it's for this reason, or, it's really discussions and ideological debates of this kind, which lead to a kind of a break in the movement and the establishment of kind of different branches in the early 1970s. Olive Morris also spent some time in China learning about economics in the period after the Great Leap Forward. And she was also a founder of OAD, the Organization of Women of African and Asian Descent. One of the things which interests me as a historian of political ideas about Olive Morris is that when she took her degree in Manchester, she set herself the task of learning political thought from the beginning, as it were. And one of the things she did is she got a copy of Hobbes's Leviathan, which some of you may have heard of, and read it from beginning to end as a kind of act of self-education. The final person I want to talk about before getting into the Mangrove Nine proper is Barbara Bees, and you can see her there in the middle of the screen holding the pig's head. Barbara Bees was brought up in Care in Britain, and it was during this period when she was in Care that the white people who were in charge of her upbringing discouraged any interest that she had in Black history or in Black culture or indeed in other Black people. So she was a person of mixed heritage, and she was very much encouraged by the people in Care to identify as white and with white culture. This obviously for Barbara Bees, this was not what she wanted to hear, and this was not how she herself wanted to express herself. And therefore, when she moved out of Care and when she moved to Brixton and Notting Hill, and when she met Darkest Hound, when she began to learn about Black Power, she immersed herself in the movement. She was one of the Mangrove Nine and one of the leading figures on the Mangrove March, and this is exactly what she's doing here on the Mangrove March. The pig's head obviously is symbolic of the police, and the pig's head is symbolic of the reaction of Black Power radicals to the police. She was one of the founder members of the Race Today collective. There is a dispute over whether she was ever in the Black Panther movement. Some people claim she was. She herself claims she was never a member of the Black Panther movement. She identified with the Black Eagles. And she was sometimes described as the British Angela Davis because of the afro that she wore, particularly on the Mangrove Campaign. So that's the kind of preamble to the Mangrove Campaign. I want to spend the next 10 minutes or so talking about the Mangrove Campaign, and hopefully then there'll be 10 minutes left for questions. So the Mangrove Campaign really is a campaign about a restaurant, and it's about a restaurant which is based in Notting Hill. The restaurant was owned and run by Frank Critchlow, who you can see there on the far right of the screen. The far right, obviously not where he belongs, but nonetheless, you know, PowerPoint is PowerPoint. So that's Frank Critchlow with the beard there on the far right of the screen. Frank Critchlow had been a member of a rock and roll band, had made some money gigging in London in the 1950s. And at the end of his kind of career as a musician, he decided he wanted to establish a cafe. The cafe called the El Rio did enormously well in Notting Hill. And then he made so much money, he was able to buy a restaurant again in Notting Hill. This restaurant became, entirely unintentionally, this was never particularly Frank Critchlow's goal or his idea, it became spontaneously and organically the centre of the black community in Notting Hill. And Notting Hill, as I'm sure you know, was one of the centres of the black community in London and in Britain in the late 1960s. So it became kind of the unofficial centre of the black community. It was also a place which was incredibly trendy, and people like the Rolling Stones went there. People like, it was just around the corner from BBC Television Centre. So basically any time there were superstars in town, particularly, you know, people from America, they would go and eat at Frank Critchlow's restaurant. And therefore, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, Frank Critchlow is doing extremely well for himself in Notting Hill. This comes to the attention of the police in the area, and the police in the area are perturbed by a number of aspects of what Frank Critchlow is doing. First of all, as I'm sure you're aware, the late 1960s and particularly the early 1970s is a period of economic calamity for Britain. So the idea that there is a black man making money and doing really well for himself in the centre of London at a time when white people are increasingly unemployed, this is something that the police are not prepared to tolerate. Secondly, it's well known that Frank Critchlow has a white girlfriend. Again, this is not something that the police at the time are prepared to tolerate. Another aspect of this story which another aspect of the story which I think is absolutely fascinating, which may interest you, I hope it does, is the relationship between Frank Critchlow, the police, and the drugs trade in Notting Hill. The police in Notting Hill, were involved in running the drugs trade. Okay, so the police had this system which they entitled recycling, whereby if they seized some drugs, they would record a proportion of that drugs and arrest somebody who had those drugs, but the rest of the drugs would never be recorded, and then they would be sold at quote unquote police prices on the streets of Notting Hill. And the way that the police justified this was that they would then put the money they earned from selling drugs in Notting Hill into buying informants. Okay, so this was the process that the police were running. So the police themselves were running the drugs racket in Notting Hill. Frank Critchlow, now the police obviously, the police are, they're white people, they have certain prejudices, and the police are assuming that the black community is going to be a big market for them for selling their product, for selling these drugs. Frank Critchlow refuses to allow the police or anyone else to sell drugs in his restaurant, okay? The police then come after Frank Critchlow because the police assume that the reason that Frank Critchlow is refusing to allow the police to sell drugs in his restaurant is because he himself must be, you know, running a drugs operation in Notting Hill. And the police assume that one of the reasons that Frank Critchlow is doing so well is because he's running drugs in Notting Hill. This, of course, is not true. Frank Critchlow ran a clean restaurant. Frank Critchlow had nothing to do with the drugs trade in Notting Hill. And the reason I can say that with such confidence and such certainty is that the Mangrove's restaurant was raided numerous times by the police. I think it's something like 30 times by the police in about 4 months at the end of 1970. And in spite of these 30 raids, not a single ounce, not a single pill, not a single cigarette, nothing like this is ever found by the police. So we can tell from the police records that Frank Critchlow's defense that he was never involved in drugs is 100% true. I think it would be very hard to raid somewhere 30 times in the course of 4 months. And you know, if there was any drugs to be found, the police would have found them. Anyway, the police are attacking the restaurant. They are raiding it regularly, and they're raiding it always on the pretext that Frank Critchlow is selling drugs. The police never managed to get a conviction against Frank Critchlow for drugs, but they are able to achieve another objective, and that is to say they drive away Critchlow's customers. Darkenside, Howe, who has recently come back from the Black Power Revolution in Trinidad, says to Frank Critchlow that what he needs to do is he needs to run a campaign. And that this campaign should be a campaign not of white lawyers, not of white journalists, not of sympathetic white liberals in powerful positions. Darkest Howe's view is that this needs to be a campaign of the black working class fighting for this area of decolonized territory in the centre of Notting Hill. And therefore Darkest Howe and Althea Jones-LeConte together set up the Mangrove March of August 1970. The Mangrove March is based on the Black Power, on the march which launched the Black Power Revolution in Trinidad. And that is to say, it's a march to the symbolic centres of white power in Notting Hill. So the march goes to the 3 police stations in Notting Hill, one after the other. The Mangrove March of August 9th, 1970, estimates differ. But we can say there were probably about 200 people on the march, and we can say that probably about 80% of those were black. And black people lead the march, white people follow. The police presence, however, we can put a very accurate figure on that because we have the official records of how many police officers were involved in the march. And there were over 700 police officers, the vast majority of them uniformed, policing a march of about 200 people. It's because of this, it's because the police effectively stopped the march about halfway through with this, it would be wrong to call it a thin blue line, with this kind of massive blue line of police presence. Because the police stopped the march, a spontaneous, violence spontaneously erupts, and there's a riot as a result of police activity on the march. It's at this point that Special Branch and the Home Office become involved, and they are trying to work out a strategy. They recognize that this is an opportunity for decapitating the Black Power movement. They recognize that there are the leadership of the Black Panthers have been involved in this, and that they can, if they act quickly and if they act right, they can put all of these people in prison, or at least give them suspended sentences. And this goes all the way up to the Home Secretary, and the Home Secretary himself, Reginald Maudlin, is involved in this. The Mangrove Nine, however, have a different approach. They are going to use the trial to turn the tables on their accusers, and they are going to use the trial. 2 of them, Darkest and Althea, represent themselves in court and speak directly to the jury. They also try the strategy of getting an all-black jury. They're unable to, but they do manage to get 2 black people in the jury, and these 2 black people in the jury are crucial in winning over white jurors. The other strategy they use is to get a working class jury. So once they recognize they're unable to get a 100% black jury, they go for a 100% working class jury. And the theory there is that the white working class themselves have experienced police violence, and therefore they will be much more willing to believe that the police are corrupt. At the same time, there's a grassroots campaign, and the grassroots campaign is led by black women outside of the Old Bailey, and this is the first time in British history that the Old Bailey is picketed. The result is a verdict that every single one of the 9 is found innocent of the main charge, and more importantly than that, the judge declares that there was evidence of racial hatred in the Metropolitan Police. So the Mangrove Nine don't simply achieve their own freedom, they achieve the first judicial acknowledgement in British history that there's evidence of racial hatred in the Metropolitan Police. Well, I recognise we only have 9 minutes left, so I'm going to stop it there, and I'd love to hear any questions you have.